We bring you a discussion on Indian diplomacy and rising India's stature in the evolving global order. The participants are Skand Ranjan Dayal, former diplomat, and Indrani Bagchi, strategic analyst. The moderator is Elizabeth Roche, associate professor, international relations. So, this evening we are going to be talking about Indian diplomacy and India's rising stature in the evolving global order. With me, I have Ambassador Tayal and Indrani Bagchi, who is CEO with Think Tank in Delhi. Welcome to both of you. September is usually a very busy month for Indian diplomacy, but this year, this September has been exceptionally busy. If we look at G20, which was on the 9th and 10th, the meeting which India hosted, and now we have External Affairs Minister who is in the US as we speak, and he has finished his meeting at the UNGA, but is in the middle of some bilateral meetings with US administration officials. So if I could ask you about what is India's stature today, if I can put it like that. If you look at the list of people that External Affairs Minister Jaishankar has met on the sidelines of the UNGA, the foreign ministers, the number of ministers that he has met, what does that say about India's stature, even compared to, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago? Indrani, if you could go first, and then if Ambassador Tayal could come in.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And well, India has been growing as a power, certainly in the last few years. And we saw a glimpse of that during the G20 summit, when India was successfully steered the membership of the African Union into the G20, which was a big diplomatic achievement. But also, I think India has increased its engagement with the rest of the world, whether it is in the developing world or the developed world. And that is, a lot of it has contributed to India's growing stature. The fact that Prime Minister Modi and External Affairs Minister Jaishankar have taken the trouble to travel to parts of the world that a number of their predecessors haven't been to has also helped. A lot that has been helped by the fact that India has managed its economy better than many others, particularly in the post-pandemic period. And that, in many ways, has been the biggest boost for India's growing stature in the world.
Ambassador Tayal?
I would say that the world today has changed, and the world of 2023 is very different than what it was 10 years ago. And India has also changed. In the last 10 years, China has emerged as an expansionist power. Then the world fought the COVID pandemic, which resulted in all kinds of economic hardships, and the Ukraine-Russia war. And the equations in the world are changing. Countries are looking at each other in a different way. Even Israel and Saudi Arabia may have some links. Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Iran have started talking to each other. And India's stature has been growing, I would say, for the last 25 years. From 1998 May, our nuclear tests brought India to the high table. After that, the IT revolution, the continued progress of economy, and now another 3-4 years, India will be the third largest economy. India's emergence as a global power, as an effective power, and most of all, what we saw in G20 or even earlier, India as a bridge, both as Foreign Minister Jaishankar said in New York, in the north side divide of the rich and the poor, and in the east-west polarization, which is re-emerging. A lot of people say that the Second Cold War is already there. And in that context, India is in a position as a bridge where it can talk to everybody. And the recent success of G20, where against all odds, there was a commonly agreed joint declaration that shows that India's stature in the world has certainly grown in the last, I will say, 25 years, and of course, in the last decade.
It's interesting that, both of you mentioned the role that India is playing, that of a bridge. One of the engagements that External Affairs Minister has had in New York is, an event which was called India UN for the Global South. That had a lot of, interesting foreign ministers, come up making very interesting remarks. For example, one of them said that India is emerging as an important player in global affairs. India deserves to have a permanent seat on the UNSC. Another one says that India is building the necessary bridges.
India is rising rapidly. Nothing can stop this rise. Now, these are all comments which are coming from the global south, and it seems as if the global south, they seem to be celebrating with us. Is this how you see it as well? Indrani, if you could go first.
Well, I think it's more than a celebration. I think there's a lot of hope and a lot of expectation, because it's not like we have arrived. We are rising, but we are rising as a power with which they hope to have a more equitable relationship. They do not have an equitable relationship with the West. They tried, and the China experience was suboptimal, because China turned out to be not just an expansionist power, but it turned out to be an extractive power and sort of snared them in debt traps, which they could have done without. In India, they see hope because they see a country like themselves, which has risen in a democratic manner, or which is still rising in a democratic manner, using tools of the modern age and not merely resources. Because if it was only resources, African countries, for instance, would be really, really rich, but they're not. And it is because India is using technology for public good. It is because India is showing itself to be a power that can share the fruits of its own labors. I mean, just witness the fact that we have offered the DPI stack, the India stack, to anybody who wants to use it and to be able to modify it to their local conditions. That's not something people do. That's not something people help others with. So I think there is a lot of more of hope and expectation rather than celebration.
Ambassador Tayal, is this the way you see it as well? Please
I
go ahead.
agree with Indrani. See, the whole global south is looking for a new world order where their voice also has some weight. And in that hope or expectation, I think India has effectively played some role in first identifying their challenges. The Summit of Global South, which was held in January in preparation of G20, that identified the challenges faced by the Global South, then articulating them and putting them in some set of recommendations, the scores of meetings which were held in the preparation of G20, and where most of the time lots of Global South countries were invited. And again, the way BRICS has been expanded, and there also in the joint Johannesburg Declaration, it is said that BRICS will go look for a new international order. So what will that be? And first identifying, then articulating those expectations, those hopes, those requirements, and feeding them to the rich countries, because India is like a permanent invite to G7. G20 now, of course, agenda has been changed by India's presidency. It is a different G20. It cannot remain confined to the economic policies, developmental issues of the 20 member countries. Now, AU, Africa Union is there, 53 countries. So their agenda will perforce have challenges of Global South in the future meetings. So not only by deeds, but also by action and by commitment. I think India has conveyed some credibility to the Global South, which we see in the comments which you mentioned, that our partners in developing countries, Global South, are saying India fully deserves to be a permanent member of the UN Security Council.
One thing which I'd like to bring in here is that, just before, India, UN, Global South, this event, there was a meeting, I think, in Cuba where the Chinese tried to position themselves also as a representative of the Global South. So how does that work in with the Global South? Is the message which is put out by the Chinese somehow more compelling, do you think? Ambassador Tayal, if you could go first this time.
I really do not like to compare India and China. China has its own way of doing things. India is the old civilization. We have a global commitment. Our track record is for everybody to see, and how we help capacity building, human resource development. We are not exploitative. We are not extractive. So India has its own way of working with our partner countries in the Global South, and it has delivered very good results. China has its own way, and it is for every country is sovereign. Every country has a choice to choose whichever way they want to go. But yes, China has deep pockets. China can invest more in projects, but at the same time, many of their projects have resulted in a debt trap. And now the whole Belt and Road Initiative projects are being cut back. So they will have their own challenges, but India should not worry about that. India has its own very principled positions and a track record of the last 70 years, and we should move on.
Right. And Rani?
Well, I agree with Ambassador Tayal because I see no reason to compare apples and oranges, and that is India and China. We've followed a very different development path. And I think we have different things that we offer to our development partners where we cannot actually compare with China. We have to remember that China is 5 times our size. So China does have deep pockets. But we have managed, without those deep pockets, we have managed to create a universe of partnerships, which I think stand on their own merit.
I think India is very thought out policy working with our partners like Japan, like United States and Australia, etc., at least in South Asia, so that the financial muscle can come from these countries and other technical support, manpower, other things can come from India to match that challenge of China, as you put it.
So if we come to the national statement that Dr. Jaishankar delivered at the UN General Assembly. Now, if you look at the speech, there are quite a few interesting elements. So if we can just go through some of them. One, of course, is this East-West polarization and the North-South divide that Ambassador Tayal referred to. In his speech, Dr. Jaishankar says that the New Delhi summit, which was the G20 summit, affirms that diplomacy and dialogue are the only effective solutions. Then he goes on to say that the international order is diverse. We must cater for divergences, if not differences. The days when few nations set the agenda and expected others to fall in line are over. To listen to others' viewpoints is not weakness. And he goes on to say that is the basis of cooperation. Now, looking at these remarks, what do you make of them? Ambassador Tayal?
The United Nations General Assembly is a forum where all the nations set out the principles on which their foreign policy, external relations, and sometimes about internal policy are based. So, for Mr. Jaishankar has really laid out the best possible rules or practices which all the countries must follow, as this is a different world and it is not that a few countries will set the agenda. As it has been happening for the last 70 years since the end of the Cold War, that new centers of power have emerged. It's a multi-centric world. Asia is rising, Indo-Pacific is rising. The whole context is different. Now, all the countries are looking at options. Middle East is the biggest example. Now, this India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, it brings even Israel and Saudi Arabia together. So, every international relationship, all equations among countries are in a state of flux, and every country is positioning itself to get maximum advantage. And in that, United Nations also has to change, modified, reformed, and all the members of United Nations who earlier, some of them had tremendous power, have to readjust also.
Okay. Indrani, what do you make of these statements by the External Affairs Minister?
Well, at the G20 summit, it became very clear that the world was much more fractured than we had imagined it to be. And in a very strange way, India literally stands at the crossroads, at the intersection of these divides. Jaishankar spoke about the East-West divide and the North-South divide. And I think by the very fact that India stood firm on its position regarding the Russia-Ukraine war, gave hope and strength to a lot of other countries who felt the same way or felt even more differently, but felt that they had the courage or the space to speak up or to take a stand that may be different from the West or the dominant narrative that we were getting from the West. Also equally different from the dominant narrative of the Russian and the Chinese. And I think we have to make that very clear too, because frankly, in many ways, we do, however, sort of rail against the sanctions that the West has imposed, and that has had consequences for all of us in the South. The fact is that Russia's actions of invading another country cannot be supported by anybody. And I think we've been clear that this is not something that India can support. But taking that middle path that India did, I think we opened the gates for many others to take similar middle paths, to believe that they could also have their point of view, that their say in global affairs without feeling a backlash from either side. And I think if you saw the give and take to achieve consensus in the G20 final declaration, especially on the Russia-Ukraine war, which was the biggest sticking point, you will see that every part of the world is also making space for divergences, for differences, and hoping that if you include that, hoping that we will be able to move together to a different place. And I think that that's something that exhibited during the G20 summit and something that Jaishankar referred to in his speech.
Yes, because there is one point where he says, from an era of non-alignment, we have now evolved to that of Vishwamitra, or a friend of the whole world. So yes, where where you say that we've evolved a middle ground, I guess this is what he was talking about, right? There are some other elements of the speech which, if I could, refer to right now. Dr. Jaishankar refers to there is a willingness to work in an open-minded manner on specific domains. And that is what is the defining characteristic of this emerging multilateral order. Then he goes on to say that all nations have national interests. We in India have never seen that as being in contradiction with global good. When we aspire to be a leading power, this is not for self-aggrandizement, but to take on more responsibility. Ambassador Tayal, how would you see this last remark of Dr. Jaishankar, taking on more responsibility?
The way India has positioned itself in the last several years, whether it is climate change, whether it is International Solar Alliance, whether it is the Ukraine-Russia war, it is all based on certain principles and an open-minded negotiation, discussion with all the interlocutors to go for the global good. And that is what Foreign Minister Jaishankar said, that yes, every country acts in its national interest, and so does India. But India's national interest is fully in alignment with the global good. There is not an era of war, then this huge push for solar energy, etc. And again, this is coming from our Foreign Minister that India is now a leading power. And leading power not in the sense of domination or a superpower, but a power which will, along with friends, other countries, will lead the world into an era of greater peace, more prosperity, and no war. And that is the, I think, grand message which came from Foreign Minister Jaishankar, that first declaration, self-declaration that India is a leading power, but it is a power which will be wielded for the global good, for the benefit of all the members, particularly of the global south in the United Nations.
But why would it be necessary to underline this particular message in terms of that if India is a leading power, it is not for self-promotion?
This is, again, every country is sovereign in theory or legally, or every country is equal. But this is a fact of life that some countries are more strong economically or militarily or intellectually or in different ways. So there is a certain hierarchy of countries, which is a reality. Like G20 is not open to all the 200 members of United Nations, which is a reality which others accept. But at the same time, the other countries which are not part of G20 or smaller groups want their voice should also be heard, and their interest should also be protected. So that is a very good balance which India is trying to have, that yes, India has achieved a certain position. It is a leading power by any yardstick, by any measure, by any standard. But we are not there just for our own benefit, our own development, our own growth. We are there to, as a leading country, to deal with the global challenges as well as the collective challenges of the global south or of the humanity. Like in climate change, India's position has been very forward looking, and we are delivering, not just talking, we are delivering. Whereas G7 countries have not produced that $100 billion which they had committed in the Paris Climate Summit. So there is a huge gap in what they say, what they do. But India, whatever it says, it commits, it does. So that is also a sign of a leading power.
Indrani, again, another element of Dr. Jaishankar's speech is that, he talks about a fair, equitable, democratic order which will surely emerge once we all put our minds to it. That is one. Then there is a reference to rule makers and rule makers not subjugating rule takers. After all, rules will work only if they apply equally to all. He talks about we shouldn't be cherry picking responses to terrorism, extremism, and violence. What do you make of these remarks?
I think that's part of India's power, if I may call it, its power wish list. I mean, this is the UN General Assembly. Okay, this is where you put out your grand ideas. The real world is much more messy. It's much less black and white, and much more complex, shall we say. So yes, that's what we want to do. Whether we end up doing it is a different matter. But then I think the intention is to say that we are coming to this with good ideas. We are coming into more responsible power space with better ideas, with a better way of dealing with the world, with a better way of helping those who may still be catching up with us.
We've had Dr. Jaishankar meeting officials in Washington. When I say officials, I mean Secretary of State Antony Blinken, National Security Advisor Sullivan. Of course, bilateral relations were a significant part of those discussions, but given the context, meaning, what Prime Minister Trudeau talked about 10 days ago, the question is how much of the discussions could have had the Canadian position on Khalistan and the shooting of Niger in the bilateral conversations that Dr. Jaishankar had with US officials. Indrani, how much do you think how much of the conversations would have happened on that?
I think some of it because, frankly, Trudeau has not given us any evidence for his accusations. You can't really make accusations against a democratic country without backing it up with any evidence. There have been little dribs and drabs of leaks, but that is not construed as evidence or even intelligence. So frankly, I think, in fact, I would say that I think Jaishankar was on fairly strong ground there, talking about Canada and Canada's support to Indian secessionist movements. Not just that, extremist ideologies, particularly violence-based ideologies, should have no place in a democratic world order. Yet we have seen all of that in play in Canada, and I'm pretty certain Jaishankar would have brought that up quite forcefully. In fact, if you've seen Justin Trudeau, I think, made a statement today to say that to the effect that he wants to engage India much, much more and is looking beyond the Niger affair. But, making that accusation without substantiating it constitutes a huge breach of international etiquette, leave alone anything else. So I would say that I think Jaishankar would have had some pretty strong words to say to his American interlocutors.
Before we close, I would like to bring in the situation in one of our neighboring countries, which is Pakistan. Today, there's been a major blast where 52 people have been killed, according to news reports. There are some other reports which say that the elections in Pakistan, general elections, have been put to sometime in January, that, we are going to have elections in Pakistan in January 2024. And this is because of some delimitation exercise. There's also another report which talks about how Pakistan is trying to get some $11 billion from China and Saudi Arabia. This is to make sure that the IMF bailout is on track. So both of you, if you could just give some closing remarks on where do you think Pakistan is going at this point, both politically and economically. Indrani, if you could go first, and then we could close with Ambassador Dayal.
Well, it's actually quite tragic that blasts have happened in Pakistan. It's not surprising to those of us who have followed Pakistan for so many years, because this is, I feel that TTP might take responsibility sooner rather than later. TTP was created by Pakistan and is now supported by the Afghan Taliban. There is really very little difference in terms of ideologies. So in a way which is really tragic for Pakistan, the snake that it has nurtured is literally turning around to bite it. I suspect things will get much worse because politically they're in a flux, with a caretaker government, elections far away, the army not quite in the driving seat, but not off the driving seat either. So literally feeling their way around. They haven't yet been able to close on their IMF deal. So whether they get a buffer infusion from Saudi Arabia or from China, the fact remains that somebody has to take charge of Pakistan's economy to bring it back to some kind of an even keel. Its politics have remained dysfunctional largely because of the nature of the Pakistan system, the difference between what is expected of the civilian authority and what the army does as a matter of course. And I think that dysfunctionality is not going to change. Pakistan has been used and likes to be used by foreign powers for their purposes. We know why China is using Pakistan. We also have seen reports that America has asked Pakistan to manufacture ammunition for Ukraine in return for America going soft on the IMF bailout. This will continue to happen to Pakistan until somebody decides that Pakistan's interests have to be defined for Pakistan and not for China or for the US or for extremist ideologies that are emanating from that region.
Ambassador Tayal, very quickly, if you could just give us your remarks as well.
Pakistan is in crisis, their economy is in crisis, less than 2% rate of growth, their internal politics is in crisis, their diplomacy is in crisis, and strategic relations. They nurtured Taliban, they nurtured this illegitimate government of Afghanistan, but see what is happening, and TTP is operating from Afghanistan, hitting Pakistan. Now, you talked about elections. January election may be held, or whenever they are held or not held. Army will make sure, along with the Election Commission of Pakistan, which is totally biased, that Imran Khan's party is not allowed to properly participate in the elections. Their president is in jail. Imran Khan himself is in jail. And whoever becomes the candidate, they will be harassed. So whoever wins, the people of Pakistan may not have that faith in whichever government emerges from in Pakistan. Whoever rules in Islamabad, ultimately the power rests with the army. And it is a failing state, but Pakistan will not be allowed to fail because of its strategic location, because of its friends, which always come out. But at some point it is United States, at another point it is Saudi Arabia, another point it is China. So it will not be allowed to fail, but it has all the symptoms of a failing state, and it will continue to descend into chaos.
So a very bleak prospect for Pakistan indeed. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Indrani.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on Indian diplomacy and rising India's stature in the evolving global order. The participants were Skand Ranjan Tayal, former diplomat, and Indrani Bagchi, strategic analyst. The moderator was Elizabeth Roche, Associate Professor, International Relations. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on your mobile app News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel News on AIR Official. You may share your feedback about this program through email at airnsgtalks@gmail.com or WhatsApp on 9289094044.